Merfolk is one of my favorite decks of all time, and it is so fun, it is so satisfying, it will never stop being my go-to deck to play to in Modern. And as of the recent BNR, by this point the One Ring I'm assuming will be banned by this point, and people are going to be looking for a new deck to flock to. And I have a wealth of information to share with everybody who's interested in this deck and intrigued to see what this deck has to offer when looking for a new competitive Modern deck that is also really solid to play on a budget. So one of the most important things that we need to understand about when we're picking up a deck is, why are we picking up this deck? There's a multitude of reasons why somebody will pick up a deck, whether that be for aesthetic value, budgetary reasons, or whether or not you just think it looks fun. I think Merfolk kind of fits every single one of these. It is a deck that I think has all sorts of play no matter the level of Magic player you are. It is an extremely competitive deck that will take you very far in your NRG and SCG runs, Modern challenges, Modern RCQs, or if you're just looking to have a good time at your local FNM, this is a fantastic deck no matter what your goal is as a Magic player. The categories I'm intending to put them in is, colloquially, we call these the Tempo Bears, Free Interaction, Mana Denial, and Lords. And then we finish it off with card advantage. So Merfolk Trickster, Harbinger of the Tides, and Floodpit's Drowner all sort of serve the same purpose of being creatures that interact with your opponent's creatures during the battle phase or the pre-combat main phase of not letting any abilities trigger or not wanting to take a lot of damage. Merfolk Trickster is the one that interacts with creatures in the most interesting way because it's able to kill creatures with the Star ability like Karnstrucks, Territorial Kavu, or even the Goyf brothers. This one is also okay at fading damage, but it's generally more useful at turning creatures blank with its Dress Down like ability. Harbinger of the Tides is a really good and effective creature at bouncing really large, powerful creatures that will just clock you extremely fast. Floodpit's Drowners does the same thing, but requires a little bit more mana and can kind of serve as more of a tempo piece because Harbinger of the Tides is able to bounce back creatures with lots of counters like a Murktide or a Psychic Frog, while Floodpit's Drowner, while also being able to keep those creatures in check, can also just shuffle them away and permanently deal with them, as opposed to Harbinger just being able to deal with them for a turn or two. So Vidalian Hexcatcher is a really powerful Merfolk Lord, being able to push through damage because of her flash ability by just surprising an opponent with damage out of nowhere. Her Force Spike-like ability to be able to counter all non-creature spells unless its controller pays 1 when you sacrifice a Merfolk is an extremely powerful effect and is able to provide a lot of tempo in combo and spell-oriented matchups like Control or Belcher. That being said, she has a weird spot in the deck now, as we have Force of Negation and Flare of Denial to be able to kind of do the same thing that she does. The only difference is that she's a creature, which is an attacking body that gets buffed up by all of our lords. She is definitely been put to the wayside since these other free counter spells, but she's a powerful spell to have if you're finding yourself struggling to deal with tons of Storm, Belcher, and other control-based, spell-based decks. So Tishana's Tidebinder is by far one of my favorite cards in the Merfolk deck. She is extremely flashy, she's extremely fancy, and she's pretty cool. When she enters the battlefield, she stifles or counters target activated or triggered ability. If the ability of an artifact or creature or planeswalker is countered this way, she shuts it off as long as she sticks around on the field. And I think that's an extremely powerful effect and extremely backbreaking tempo play, especially if you're on the play. If your opponent's on the draw and you just have to deal with back-to-back Tidebinders, this is a card that will definitely win you the game, especially with the fact that it starts swinging for 3 as it enters the battlefield. She is a card that I kind of have a hard time cutting no matter the meta we're in, but keep in mind that she is always much better when there are large things that people are tapping out for that require activated or triggered abilities to go off before the bannings. I'm assuming that the ring is banned by this point. She's good into cards like the ring, Karn, or even just getting small, powerful tempo plays like Leyline Binding or Static Prison. She is really good and really versatile, and very rarely has a bad situation where she can be cast in, even as just a simple 3/2 flash body to just get in some damage going. Tidebinder is always a card that I recommend you keep into your tackle box as long as you're playing Merfolk. So free interaction is a really vital part about Merfolk's game plan. Making sure that you're able to keep a steady flow of damage on top of free interaction is one of the most vital parts about playing Merfolk, and understanding when to use this interaction and when to hold back is absolutely a necessity to becoming a really competent Merfolk player. Flare of Denial and Force Negations are the most important free interaction that we have access to, and the ones that we're generally going to be using throughout the course of our games. Force Negation is an extremely powerful counterspell in Merfolk's arsenal. Being able to utilize its alternative cost the best than any other modern deck can is a really, really cool upside of the deck. Basically everything in your deck is a blue card, so it will naturally pitch to Force Negation, making it live 100% of the time. And despite its timing restriction, a lot of the time that works a lot in your favor, because it allows you to tap out consistently for really powerful creatures and to be able to develop your board without being in worry of your opponent slamming down a really powerful haymaker that you need to make sure doesn't resolve. Like Karns and One Rings. Hopefully it's banned, which I hope it is by this point, and other really strong non-creature spells. And one of the upsides of Force Negation is the fact that it does exile, which means that no Snapcaster flashbacks or no Past in Flames flashback is a really relevant upside to always keep this counterspell in Merfolk's tackle box. So Flare of Denial is an extremely powerful counterspell that is in Merfolk's arsenal now since the advent of Modern Horizons 3, and one of the most interesting things about Merfolk now with the introduction of Flare of Denial is the fact that you're actually able to counter creatures, which was notoriously pretty hard for the deck to deal with. And now that we have this really powerful card that allows us to interact with any card on the stack at just a cost of just a blue creature, which for the most part is all of our deck, it makes for a really potent and powerful tempo play to be able to deal with a lot of haymakers in the same way the Force of Negation can, but with the added upside is that you can deal with it at any point in the time. There is no timing restriction on Flare of Denial, so one of the things that makes it really powerful is allowing cards to resolve through counterspells when you don't have Cavern of Souls, and also being able to just protect yourself from really bad cards that are just hazardous for the health of your fish. Lining up the last bits of free interaction that Merfolk has access to is Subtlety. Subtlety is a really interesting card out of the bunch, considering the fact that it doesn't really see as much play anymore, despite the fact that it is still an extremely powerful and potent card that can deal with creatures in a way that Force or Flare cannot. Depending on what your needs are as a Merfolk player. Flare is a lot more versatile in the sense that it can answer creatures in a much more clean way, but Subtlety is a 3/3 flying body, which at the low cost of being able to exile Shocker, another blue card, which what Merfolk is full of, doesn't actually really hurt you in the longevity of it, as also you're able to scam the Subtlety with Tishana's Tidebinder, being able to stifle your own evoke trigger. Subtlety has a lot of really interesting utility in the deck that is, despite its long-lasting time in the deck, has yet to be unexplored to its fullest potential, but is still a notable card to have in your toolbox if you're finding that you need to deal with a lot of powerful creatures that cannot resolve and also need that tempo play, like Primeval Titan, Karns, and etc., because it also does answer Planeswalkers. So another aspect of the Merfolk strategy that is super integral to this deck's game plan is the mana denial strategy. While it doesn't look like it on its face, the deck can actually just become a mono blue Ponza deck and completely lock your opponent out of casting spells entirely in a prison-esque way. And the way you utilize this is actually pretty amazing, because a lot of the things that are doing it are also Merfolk, like Harbinger of the Seas, our most recent addition for Modern Horizons, Rishudan Dockhand, which is another Modern Horizons card, Tide Shaper, another Modern Horizons card, and you're kind of getting a theme for what Merfolk is supposed to be doing, is that it has an ability to basically completely turn everything into an island, and for the most part that is super useless for a lot of modern decks to be able to have just mono islands. And Spreading Seas is another honorary Merfolk that is able to work in this strategy, but this is super not necessary unless specifically you have a lot of big mana or you find the need to cut your opponent off a lot of mana, a vital part of winning. And definitely can come in and out depending on the needs of the Merfolk player. So Rishudan Dockhand, beginning off with our 1-drops, is a sneaky little 1-mana 1/2 that has a lot of upside despite the fact that it seems like draft chaff in all honesty, but a lot of the deck is all about synergy, and the fact that it is a Merfolk with inherent Island Walk is a big deal when a lot of your strategy involves turning your opponent's lands into islands. So it's able to sneak in for little bits of damage while also being able to disrupt the opponent who is maybe late on lands or falling behind and stumbling. And this is a big part of what makes Rishudan Dockhand very powerful and very versatile, is that it's able to be a disruptive tempo piece while also being a beat stick once some lords get into play. But not only that, but it's able to just provide some tempo by being a blue creature to sacrifice to Flare, as it also likes to be a very heavy removal magnet because of the fact of its obnoxious and disruptive ability. It can really set opponents back a couple turns by just getting their lands constantly reshard and ported every single turn. So keep that in mind when you're building your next Merfolk deck, is that if you want to play heavy into the mana denial strategy, you can never go wrong with some number of Dockhands in your main deck. So rounding out the last of our 1-drops, is, I know this is very sad, only 2 worthwhile Merfolk 1-drops, possibly Mockingbird, but that's probably a good time for another video. But Tide Shaper is another really important 1-drop in the Merfolk strategy, as it does a lot of the things that I previously mentioned with Dockhand by being a disruptive tempo piece that can target basic lands. The only difference is this one turns them into islands, and this is a really big deal when a big part of your deck is oriented around Harbinger of the Seas, which can just completely lock down all non-basics, with your 1-drops covering all the basics. And so they work hand in hand with one another in tandem and in unity to make sure that your opponent can't cast any spells as long as these disruptive little guys are out on the field. And they work extremely well in this regard because they seem rather innocuous at first and are able to be ignored until it becomes too late and your opponent is completely out of the game and locked out of their mana. And Tide Shaper is an important part to facilitate Island Walk and ensure that you can get in for game. So Harbinger of the Seas is a busted magic card. There's not much to say about this card other than the fact that it gives the freest wins in the world that Merfolk had no business ever winning. But that is the power of this card and a huge and important part of the Merfolk utility tackle box. And it is something that you should never leave home without, because not only does it help facilitate your plan of enabling Island Walk, but it just gives the freest wins against decks that otherwise would just roll over you. 3-color decks with tons of removal, 2-color decks with tons of removal, and not only that, but big mana decks that just go over the top of you. Harbinger of the Seas does everything that you want and more. It is disruptive, it is obnoxious, it is a Merfolk, it gets in for damage. There's not much to say about this card other than the fact that it is utilized in our deck a lot better than I would say other decks, as it can get buffed by a lot of the Merfolk lords, and it is able to be put in through Vial. So a lot of the typical counterplay, like getting fetches, is not as powerful when you consider the fact that we completely were talking about other cards that turn your basics into islands and then tap them down. Harbinger can basically be the nail in the coffin against a lot of decks, especially if they're not playing around it right, with Aether Vial backup and free counter magic. This is a card that is integral to your game plan, and make sure you protect her at all costs. Despite the fact that she is really, really strong, she can sometimes cause some issues with Cavern and Mutavault, but that being said, she is a mainstay of the Merfolk strategy, and that you should always play for until, who knows, she gets Power Corrupt. We'll see with Modern Horizons 4. But that being said, playing with her as much as you can for right now, because she is not going anywhere. So for a while I've been referencing a card called Lords. Lord this, Lord that, gets pumped by Lords. I think it's important to preface this that this card is by far the weakest card in the deck, but also weirdly enough the most necessary part of the deck, unless, you know, future advancements come about to where these are no longer necessary. But I think a good portion of Merfolk's ability to win games doesn't just come from its disruptive tempo bears, because if you were just playing 2-mana 2/2s for 2 and winning with them, you would be playing Death and Taxes instead. In fact, I think this is a special part of this deck that is absolutely necessary for it to get its wins, bar none. And without further ado, I would love to introduce to you one of the most important parts, but the worst part of the deck.
It's time for the moment you've been waiting for. Preparing the
Lord of Atlantis.
The Unblockable Lords, Master of the Pearl Trident, and Lord of Atlantis are by far the centerfolds of the deck. They hold the deck together, and I believe are a big reason to why this deck is even worth considering, besides its disruptive pieces, its free interaction, and even Harbinger of the Seas. If not for the fact that Lord of Atlantis and Master of the Pearl Trident did not exist, I believe that this deck would not actually have a very functional place in Modern, because this is the way that you're able to turn the corner. The way that you turn 2 damage into 3 damage, 3 damage into 7, and 7 into 10. And this is by far, I think, one of the most necessary parts of the deck, despite the fact that at times it has been cut down from 8 to 6, and even 5, and sometimes 4. But they are always inherent to the deck because they allow you the ability to go around giant creatures when otherwise you would get stonewalled. And how you utilize these creatures is the same way that you would kind of think of Murktide, in a way where you just use these creatures as the way to turn the corner when you're finally ready to have a good, stable control of the game, because you have the necessary piece of free interaction, the necessary piece of tempo bears, or the necessary ways that they've been locked out of their mana. These are the things that ensure that you make this game finish quickly, because otherwise you are going to durdle and fall behind. And Lord of Atlantis and Master of the Pearl Trident will make sure that you get that game done before time goes and you can go get some lunch after you're done with your sets. There is a lot of removal in Modern, and so one would actually have to ask a very legitimate question: is how does Merfolk even keep up with decks that are full of Fatal Push, Lightning Bolt, Galvanic Discharge, Static Prison, Leyline Binding, Wrath of the Skies, Supreme Verdict, Lightning Bolt, did I mention that? I don't know, Path to Exile, Isolate, everything that you can imagine in the book. Fish die to them. Oh yeah, Orcish Bowmasters, can't forget about that one. But the beautiful thing is that your deck is in blue, and so you have access to a lot of card advantage through the access of Swaylune and Silvergill Adept and Spreading Seas. These are all cards that just draw cards naturally that are pretty good, but obviously in a world of Orcish Bowmasters, one would have to look away from cards like Orcish Bowmasters, and you still have a lot of inherent card advantage despite that, because you have the access of a lot of utility lands like Mutavault, Sink into the Stupor, and Cavernous Souls, and Glasspool Mimic, and a lot of other options that are still waiting to be discovered out of the Merfolk toolbox. And one of the things that makes Merfolk really interesting to me is that it does have a lot of latent card advantage through its access of lands and creatures, and how you are able to utilize that and make sure that all your draws are live is that Merfolk always has a natural ability to churn through his deck and also guarantee that a lot of its lands also double as damage or interaction or more abilities to interact with creatures. If you've gotten this far into the video, then I really appreciate you sticking around because it was all worthwhile because we got to enjoy this lovely journey together, learning about fish, learning about free mana, and learning about turning stuff into islands. It's been a good time. But I have some burning questions that I had to ask nobody else but the Merfolk Master themselves, as he was so gracious enough to take some time out of his day and answer some questions about why you should even pick up Merfolk in Modern. All right, so if you've made it this far into the guide, then I appreciate you because I have none other than the Merfolk Master himself, Nikachu. Welcome. Thank you for being on this guide and, kind of helping explain to people why Merfolk is a viable option in Modern to be able to take along.
Well, what I love most about Merfolk in Modern, and I've played it for over a decade, is its adaptability. It's actually really surprisingly adaptable to its environment. How you can change in and out the different types of creatures, and also because we're blue, of course, we have this full suite of millions of different counter spells between actual counter spell, consign to memory, spell pierce, dispel, force of negation, and we're getting new tools all the time like Flare of Denial. So you can always expect that at the very least, even if Merfolk doesn't get new tools in the future, Blue will.
No, and I totally agree. And that kind of leads into like my first question is like, what do you believe the competitive value is of Merfolk, and what kind of metas do you actually think people should be looking at Merfolk if they're looking to spike a tournament or take something to an RCQ or take something over to a bigger event?
Somehow the tricksiness of the deck has some sort of value. I sort of look at Merfolk as a deck where the creatures are the spells. Usually, a lot of decks will be like spell, 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 payoff. You could see that in a control deck. You could see that in a mid-range deck. Whereas in Merfolk, the creatures are the spells. The Hexcatcher is a spell. The Tishana's Tidebinder is a spell. The Silvergill Adept is basically a spell. It does something, plus it's a body on the battlefield. Now, that being said, the body is pretty weak. Also, the spell's effect is also pretty weak. So you have to line the effect of the spell to line up well with your opponent's deck to get the full value. So then your spell had impact on your opponent, plus you have a body left behind. So that's really the value of Merfolk, and basically the difficulty of lining up the utility of your creatures with your opponent's threats, or using them as an answer. What was the second part of the question?
What kind of metas do you generally think you want Merfolk in? Like, what kind of like decks do you ideally want to see at the top of the space? Not like energy.
I mean, traditionally, the only meta that we don't like is speed. Anything that is super fast, super low to the ground, gets a lot of value off of very little mana. That is the enemy of Merfolk. It has been in the past with Affinity. It has been in the past with humans, and it also is currently with Boros Energy. So anything that is super super aggro. Sometimes there were some environments where Dredge was too quick, too quick. Hand card draw, discard, card draw, discard, and they have a bunch of bodies on the battlefield. So what we prefer are things that are more slow moving, more mid-rangey, that gives us some opportunity to get our creatures on the battlefield because we got a clunky deck. So we're not going to win on we're not going to win on the mana curve, but we can win if the games are a lot more patient.
No, I totally agree, and I think that's kind of like the value of fish is that like it almost like your Merfolk are kind of inherently like two for ones because you do something to them and then you're also advancing your board state by using that tempo. Because that kind of also kind of leads into the next segment of like, do you think Merfolk has any core tenets for deck building? Like, if someone is trying to build their own Merfolk deck and trying to understand, like, what do I want to put into my deck? Do you think that there's any kind of like core fundamental principles that they should understand when building their deck from the ground up?
The only core principle I try to live by is be flexible. I think the biggest problem for a lot of other archetypes and communities is that they weren't flexible. They focus too much on what's core and then they try to build around it. Whereas I think we should be as open as possible to ripping out as much core as necessary when the cards don't work and experiment with new cards that are brought to us as they're being printed. After all, the power level of Magic the Gathering is getting stronger, and it would be the most beneficial to adopt those types of cards into your own archetype. Honestly, a card like Subtlety, obviously we could play it from the beginning, but a lot of people didn't really experiment with it until somebody got some results with it, and now it's completely core to the Merfolk archetype, either as like a 2, 3, or 4 of for everybody. So I would just say it's very core to be flexible, because the more rigid and constricted Merfolk list is the one that's going to lose over the long term. The reason Merfolk has been successful for so long is because it rapidly changes as the metagames change.
No, yeah, and I totally agree. I mean, we kind of saw that when you were experimenting with your blue black deck and putting Psychic Frog, and you got a lot of pushback by putting, like, this is not a Merfolk. This can't be in the deck. It is not a Merfolk. I mean, it's like an honorary fish, you know? It's another amphibian to put into the deck. So I get that. And, you know, and we're seeing that a little bit more with like your most recent video where you dropped Aether Vial completely,
Hmm.
and looking at like some of the core tenets of Fish is that yeah, it is a super adaptable deck and it really can build itself in a really unique way. And that's kind of, I think, some of the value of this deck is that as metagames progress, archetypes will naturally like have new cards that fit into that same style. You know, we see creature combo decks exist and come and go, from Melirapod to Yogg to Kiki Cord and all that sort of stuff. And I feel like Merfolk should naturally progress itself in that way. Maybe it starts off at Merfolk as a blue black tempo deck and then mono blue tempo. And I think that makes a perfect amount of sense. But I guess for the next question, then does Merfolk, do you believe, have any longevity as like a safe investment? You know, one of the things that people always talk about modern is that it's a rotating format. It's really tumultuous. How can I buy a
Hmm.
deck and, you know that I can get my money's worth out of this deck? Do you confidently think that you can give someone Merfolk and feel like it'll always stand the test of time as, like, you know, more and more cards are produced, like you said, at like an alarmingly powerful rate?
To be honest, I mean, I would have never predicted that Merfolk could stand as strong as it has been today. Fortunately, Wizards of the Coast, they don't throw that many bones to Merfolk, but when they do, they actually matter. Between Vidalian Hexcatcher, Tide Shapers, Feloon, Tishana's Tidebinder, and so I think I can somewhat expect that they're going to throw us a bone. Even like one card a year would be useful. But I'll tell you what the single most important thing that you want to be looking at when you are investing in a deck for the long run. And that is a community. And the Merfolk community is super strong. Like, we have a lot of really stubborn people that are not gonna like dump this deck so easily. So you really want to be investing in the community, not the deck. There's a lot of people who buy into a deck, but it doesn't really have a strong community. So when the deck doesn't do well and the whole community falls apart, well, then no one wants to innovate. No one wants to try new things. And one reason that Merfolk has done so well and stayed strong and has a lot of developers and people committed to the archetype is because the community is strong. I mean, just look how many YouTube channels there have been made over Merfolk for Merfolk over the years. And look, and you're also contributing to it with this guide.
No, yeah, I mean, like it's crazy to me, right? Because there are not really like really good resources to just look at for just, hey, if I need to like understand some of the core tenets of what should I look out for a fish deck. The best thing that you can find is a Tolarian Community College video from like 10 years ago. Curse Catcher was $20 at the time in that video, so it's like I know it's insane. So no, yeah, I think that's really a really sound advice, because I do think that Merfolk has a lot of value in just like having a safe bet and just keeping its longevity, because it does have a really consistent community of people. I guess this is kind of gonna probably date itself, but so the BNR is coming up, and obviously energy is big on the talks. The One Ring is a lot on the talks. Um, on the off chance that the Ring and energy doesn't get hit, what do you look like for Merfolk's future in adapting to the One Ring? Should Merfolk adapt the ring into its archetype? It's kind of something I've thought about a little bit. And how will it adapt to energy if the hits aren't good enough because of scheduled BNRs?
Well, I mean, I haven't experimented with the One Ring, but it's worth experimenting. Like, I don't know what the right build looks like because I only have so many hours in the day myself. I try not to wildly experiment because that just takes a lot of time. But there are people within the community that like to do that. And if it wasn't for the people that tried these off-ball ideas, we wouldn't be utilizing these new ones in the future of the Merfolk archetype. All these people try and experiment and brew with Merfolk, and I'm like, okay, you guys do that. But then once in a while, they're like, you know what? I got a 4-1 with this list, and I'm like, you know what? That card actually, I think it would work in the meta game, and I'll adapt it myself. So I have no idea what the build of the One Ring with Merfolk would look like, but it's definitely worth exploring. If energy is still on top, we are facing some dark times for Merfolk. I've been there with in the humans metagame. Merfolk was just worse because they are just a super fast deck. There weren't many good answers to humans at the time, and we just have to slug it out with like a sort of a poor, weak win rate because it will always be a deck to beat. But here's the good news. Almost everyone has a bad matchup
Yeah.
versus energy and its variants. So at some point they're gonna hammer something and hammer it again until it's gonna be a little bit more level with the playing field.
No, yeah, that makes sense. Because, like I said, Merfolk has like a lot of really cool aspects to it, and I think it's just a really good entry level deck. And actually, that is the last question: is that do you think Merfolk is an acceptable deck to get in on a budget? If you were to recommend like somebody to get into Modern, and you were saying like, "Hey, let's play some Modern," do you think Merfolk is a good entry level deck because of its cost? And despite the fact that it does reward a lot of deck specialists like you and I who like really just play the deck a lot and a lot, is this something that you would feel kind of comfortable giving to a player who is trying to learn Modern?
It's funny because for years I've built Merfolk decks for about around $100 or maybe, $150, which is a really low rate for getting into Modern. A lot of people are incredibly intimidated by the prices of Modern decks because now they're pushing like $1,000. So for that reason, I think Merfolk is a great archetype to get into Modern, to get your feet wet, so to say,
Yeah.
with the in this format. And then whether you want to progress your journey with Merfolk and upgrade it, or just move on to another archetype because you've now saved up the money for something much higher in the tiers. I mean, that's up to them, but I think Merfolk is one of the better decks that you're gonna have a pretty good shell even on a budget. A lot of expensive cards are like Chalice of the Void, Cavernous Souls. Those aren't core to the deck. Like Cavernous Souls, it's great. It gives you a huge advantage, but you know what? Basic island, not that bad. All right, it's a land is a land. It still casts your creatures all the same against a huge variety of decks anyway.
No, I agree. You can get like the whole Merfolk shell for like I think less than $100. Weirdly
Hmm.
enough, Lord of Atlantis has gotten like the most expensive out of all of them,
Yeah.
which it's so bizarre. Like a full playset's like $30 to $40 as of the recording of this video, and yeah, it's interesting. And I think the nice thing about Merfolk is that it has like a lot of cards that are like very general force and negation, flare denial, subtlety. Like if you're sick of the deck for whatever reason, God
Hmm.
forbid, you can like eventually decide that I want to build like an Izzet deck. I want to build a Jeskai deck. You'll have like a lot of, or even Belcher, right? Because a lot of the cards we share with Belcher, weirdly
Yeah.
enough. So like there's a lot of really good cards that Merfolk at least builds into that when you buy it, it's not just for this one archetype outside of the Merfolk themselves.
Hmm. Exactly.
All right, and I that basically answers all my questions. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. But do you have any like kind of like last like things that people should take into consideration when they're finally like getting around to build the deck and ready to sleeve up some games, go to their FNM? Because I do believe that this is a deck that is great at all levels of play. I mean, you showed us earlier this year at your Energy Finals, which I wish you good luck by the way this weekend. That's going to be really exciting to watch. So yeah, any final things for people who are ready to like start swimming in with the school?
Well, the last thing I would just say is Merfolk is very heavily a lose and learn deck. If you get surprised by some card, because of a lack of experience in the matchup or a lack of experience with the format. That's okay, because you'll be prepared for it next time. And Merfolk, you get the full value out of this archetype when you can anticipate every card your opponent could possibly play, and you are prepared for basically the entire format in front of you. You know what you're prepared for, and you know what you're not prepared for, but that's fine because you know what you're going into. So that's the only thing I would say, is that it's get experience, because that's what matters the most in this deck. You're going to be carried with your experience and not just the brute force power of your cards, because frankly that's not what Merfolk is known for. If you want to win off of the brute force power of your cards, you got to play whatever tier 1 deck there is over there.
I totally agree, especially with the crazy nature of all these Modern Horizons cards. And maybe we'll see what we get in Modern Horizons 4. All right, with that, I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Nikachu.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
So thank you for watching. The purpose of this video was to inform players about Merfolk and all of its power that it has behind it. And I know there are a lot of feelings about Modern and the health of the format with energy and the One Ring being rampant, and in general a much more philosophical, I guess, and spiritual loss of the identity of Modern because of these straight to modern sets, Modern Horizons basically being rampant and all over the place. And the purpose of this video, beyond informing and educating the public about Fish, was to kind of show that the spirit of Modern doesn't have to die because of Modern Horizons, that you can play your favorite cards and keep innovating with them and make them work, as long as you're able to, maybe slap some Modern Horizons cards in there, but also play to the best of your ability as a player. Because I am firmly of the belief that if you are dedicated to a deck and a strategy or archetype, that you will be rewarded for your legacy skill, and that the player who, in general, knows more about the game will win. And this was the purpose of this video, is to show that you can play an archetype that has been around since the literal inception of Modern and the inception of Magic as a whole, and still have a great amount of competitive success and, most importantly, fun. And I hope you guys just have fun with a really competitive budget deck that can last for a very long time. Thank you for watching.